The late afternoon sun bled a deep orange over the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, painting the weathered wooden buildings in a light that promised the coming cool of night. From the porch of the saloon, Jacob Reacher watched the town's annual social unfold with a familiar, hollow feeling in his chest. He was a man who had everything the frontier valued: land, cattle, money enough to last 3 lifetimes. The proof of it was in the respectful nods he received from passing townsfolk and the wide berth given to him by lesser men. Yet, as laughter and the lively scrape of a fiddle spilled from the town square, Jacob felt utterly separate from it all, an island of solitude in a sea of merriment. The centerpiece of the social was the charity auction, an event where folks donated goods, services, and even a day's labor to raise funds for the town schoolhouse. Jacob had already bought a clumsily carved wooden horse for a sum that would have bought a real one, and his contribution now sat on the table beside him, forgotten. His attention, like that of many others, was drawn to a solitary figure on the edge of the crowd. She was a woman shrouded in shadow despite the setting sun. Dressed in a dress of plain, unadorned black wool, she seemed to draw the heat from the air around her. A wide-brimmed hat sat low on her brow, and from it hung a veil of dark netting so dense it completely obscured her features. She was a silent statue, a patch of midnight amidst the day's fading glow. Whispers trailed in her wake, a current of curiosity and mild suspicion. She was the widow Vance, new to Redemption Creek, and her profound silence and complete concealment had become the town's favorite mystery. Jacob's contemplation of the widow was shattered by a loud, boisterous voice at his elbow. Hank, a rancher from the North Valley whose ambition far outstripped his herd's size, clapped a heavy hand on the porch post, making the whole structure shudder. "Quite a spectacle, ain't she, Reacher?" Hank grinned, his teeth yellowed against his coarse beard. "Looks like a black crow waitin' for a storm. They call her the Ghost Widow. Ain't showed her face to a soul since she arrived." Jacob gave a non-committal grunt, wishing to be left alone with his thoughts. But Hank was a man fueled by whiskey and a need to prove himself against the town's most successful man. "Makes a man wonder what's under all that netting," Hank mused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "Probably so ugly she'd scare the bark off a tree." He laughed at his own joke, a harsh, barking sound. "Leave it be, Hank," Jacob said, his voice low and tired. "The woman's in mourning. She deserves her peace." "Peace," Hank snorted. "Or is she just hidin'? Tell you what, Reacher, I'll make you a bet." The word bet caught the attention of a few other men nearby who drifted closer, smelling entertainment. "I bet you my prize bull, the one you've been eyeing for a year, that you ain't got the nerve to go over there and bring that strange creature home with you tonight. Offer her a job as your new housekeeper. See if the Ghost Widow can cook and clean." A few of the men chuckled nervously. It was a cruel, foolish wager. Jacob felt a flare of anger. He was not a man to be baited, nor did he appreciate his home being used as the punchline of a joke. He looked from Hank's smug, challenging face to the solitary black figure across the square. He saw the way the townspeople subtly curved their paths to avoid her. He was a man of action, a man who commanded respect through his deeds, and this entire scene pricked at his pride. The hollow feeling in his chest was suddenly filled with a stubborn, reckless impulse. "You're a fool, Hank," Jacob said, his voice cutting through the evening air. "But that's a fine bull." He pushed himself away from the porch post, his tall frame straightening to its full height. "You have a deal." A ripple of excitement went through the growing crowd. This was more thrilling than any auction. Jacob Reacher, the richest man in the territory, was going to confront the Ghost Widow on a dare. Jacob ignored their stares, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust as he crossed the wide street. His heart hammered not from nerves, but from a fierce determination to see this through, to prove his point to Hank and to himself. He stopped a few feet from her. Up close, the black veil was utterly impenetrable. He could not see even the faintest shadow of the person within. The sounds of the social seemed to fade away. "Ma'am," he began, his voice firmer than he expected. "I am Jacob Reacher." There was no response from the dark figure. He pressed on, speaking the words he decided on during his short walk. "I find myself in need of a housekeeper at my ranch. The position offers room, board, and fair wages. I would consider it a kindness if you would accept." A long, silent moment passed. Jacob wondered if she had even heard him. The veil tilted slightly, as if she were studying him from her hidden world. He expected a refusal, a shocked gasp, anything. Instead, a voice emerged from behind the netting. It was quiet, but clear and steady, devoid of any emotion that might betray her thoughts. "I accept, Mr. Reacher." The crowd, which had been holding its breath, erupted in a wave of astonished murmurs. Hank's jaw dropped open in comical disbelief. Jacob himself was taken aback. He had been prepared for an argument, not this immediate, calm surrender. He offered his arm, a gesture of pure habit. After another moment's hesitation, a gloved hand emerged from the black folds of her sleeve and rested lightly on his forearm. It was a small, cold weight. Without another word, he led the mysterious widow Vance away from the whispering crowd, away from the music and the light, and into the gathering darkness of the road that led to his ranch. The bet was won, but Jacob felt a strange and unsettling certainty that the true cost of it had yet to be paid. The ride to the Reacher Ranch was a journey undertaken in near total silence, a heavy quiet broken only by the steady clop of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the creak of the wagon's leather traces. Jacob guided the team with a practiced hand, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, yet his mind was entirely occupied by the enigmatic figure seated beside him. She was a statue carved from shadow, her back straight, her veiled head facing forward, offering no conversation, no reaction to the landscape unfolding around them. The vast, rolling hills of his land, usually a source of immense pride, seemed to hold no interest for her. The imposing outline of the ranch house as it came into view, a testament to his success with its wide porches and sturdy timber frame, elicited no comment. She simply existed beside him, a silent, black hole in the fabric of the evening. Upon arrival, the silence deepened. Jacob, feeling an awkwardness he hadn't experienced in years, showed her to a small, spare cabin that stood a respectful distance from the main house. It was used occasionally for hired help during roundups, but had stood empty for some time. "This will be your quarters," he stated, his voice echoing slightly in the small, dusty space. "You'll take your meals in the main house after you've prepared them. The chores are yours. I expect the place to be kept clean and meals to be ready on time." He delivered the instructions as if he were addressing a new foreman, his tone all business, a defense against the strange intimacy of the situation. The veiled head gave a single, slow nod of understanding. The next morning, a new rhythm was established, one dictated by the silent widow. Jacob would wake to find the fire in the main house's kitchen stove already lit, a pot of coffee beginning to perk. He would see her moving through the rooms like a dark ghost, a bucket of soapy water in hand, a rag dusting shelves with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. She was, he had to admit, an excellent worker. Floors were scrubbed until they gleamed, windows were washed until they seemed to disappear, and the simple meals she prepared, stews, cornbread, roasted meats, were flavorful and perfectly cooked. Yet, the mystery of her remained absolute. Inside the house, she never removed her heavy black wig or the veiled hat. It became a bizarre sight, this fully shrouded figure kneading bread dough or polishing silverware, the dark netting swaying with her movements. Jacob found himself watching her, his initial guilt over the cruel bet slowly curdling into a potent mixture of frustration and intense curiosity. Who was she? Why this absolute refusal to reveal herself, even in the privacy of his home? Was it grief or something else? He gave strict instructions to his foreman, Jesse, a man of few words and deep loyalty. "The widow is to do her work undisturbed," Jacob told him, standing by the corral as the hands prepared for the day. "No one is to bother her. No teasing, no questions. You understand." Jesse, a man who had seen Jacob through good times and bad, simply nodded, his wise eyes flicking toward the main house before returning to his boss. "Seems like she could use the quiet," was all he said, and Jacob felt a pang of something like shame. Days turned into a week. The widow, Eleanor Vance, became a fixture, yet she remained a complete stranger. Her silence was a wall Jacob didn't know how to breach. He would sometimes attempt a question over supper, which they ate at opposite ends of the long wooden table. "The stew is good," he'd offer. A silent nod from the Vale was his only reply. "We'll need to mend the fence in the north pasture tomorrow." Another nod. Her world was confined to her tasks, her cabin, and the impenetrable barrier of black netting she wore like a second skin. Jacob's home, once just a quiet and lonely place, now felt charged with a strange tension. It was the tension of the unknown, of a secret living under his own roof. He was a man accustomed to challenges. He could see a stubborn bull, a broken fence, a drought. This was different. This was a puzzle, a silent, moving riddle in a black dress, and with each passing day, his desire to solve it grew, intertwining with a deepening sense that his foolish wager had brought something far more complex into his life than he had ever imagined. The house was spotless, the food was excellent, but the air was thick with everything that remained unseen and unsaid. A fortnight had passed since the widow's arrival, and a fragile, silent routine had settled over the Reacher ranch. The initial shock of the bet had faded for the hands, replaced by a wary acceptance of the veiled woman who kept to herself and performed her duties with an almost supernatural quietness. For Jacob, however, the tension had not eased. It had merely changed its shape, transforming from awkwardness into a gnawing, constant curiosity that followed him from the corrals to the supper table. He found his eyes tracking her movements, searching for some clue, some crack in her armor of black wool and netting, but she remained an enigma, sealed away from the world. The evening it happened was unremarkable. A thin, cold rain had begun to fall, whispering against the windows and tamping down the dust in the yard. Supper was long over, and Jacob, having reviewed his ledgers by the fire, realized he had not seen Eleanor return to her cabin. A plate of food, kept warm in the oven, remained untouched. A prickle of concern, faint but persistent, urged him to action. He took the plate, covered it with a cloth, and pulled on his heavy coat before stepping out into the damp, chilly night. The light from her cabin window was a soft, golden square in the darkness, a beacon in the gloom. As he approached, he noticed the door was not latched but stood slightly ajar, perhaps to let in the cool, rain-washed air. He could see a sliver of the room's interior, a simple bed, a chair, a small hearth where a fire crackled cheerfully. He raised his hand to knock, his knuckles poised an inch from the wood. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice sounding loud in the quiet, wet hush of the night. "I've brought your supper. You didn't come to collect it." There was no answer. Perhaps she was already asleep. He pushed the door open another few inches, intending only to leave the plate on the chair inside. And then he saw her. She was standing with her back to the door, before a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. And she was not the woman he knew. The heavy black wig was gone, set aside on the bed. In the firelight, her real hair was revealed, a short, pale cap of silver gold waves that clung softly to her head. But it was not her hair that stole the breath from Jacob's lungs and rooted his boots to the threshold. As she turned, startled by the sound of the door, the full truth was unveiled. The right side of her face and neck, from her temple down past her collar, was a landscape of mottled, twisted skin, a web of shiny, faded scars that spoke of an old and terrible agony. The firelight caught the smooth, taut patches, highlighting the stark contrast between the ruined skin and the pale, unmarked beauty of the left side of her face. Her eyes, wide with a terror so profound it was like a physical blow, met his in the mirror's reflection. Time seemed to stop, congealing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Jacob stood frozen, the plate of food forgotten in his hand. His mind, usually so quick and decisive, went utterly blank, wiped clean by the shock of the revelation. This was her secret. This was the reason for the veil, the wig, the silence, the flight from a cruel world. It was not ugliness he saw, but the brutal evidence of survival, a map of pain she was forced to carry every moment of her life. Her hand flew to her cheek, a futile gesture to hide what he had already seen. A small, broken sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but a gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked like a wild animal caught in a trap, expecting the blow that always followed discovery. She waited for his recoil, for the gasp of disgust, for the slammed door and the shouted order to leave his land at once. But the blow did not come. The paralysis that had seized Jacob broke, not into revulsion, but into a wave of understanding so vast it left him humbled. He saw the bet with Hank for the monstrous cruelty it was. He saw her acceptance of his offer not as surrender, but as the desperate act of a woman with no other options. Slowly, with a care he would use around a spooked foal, he stepped fully into the room. He never took his eyes from hers, holding her terrified gaze with his own. He crossed the small space and placed the plate of food gently on the small table beside her bed. His voice, when he finally found it, was low and rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm sorry," he said, the words terribly inadequate for the violation he had committed. "I shouldn't have come in without asking." He didn't look away from her scars, didn't pretend they weren't there. He simply acknowledged them, and in doing so, acknowledged her. Then, before his presence could frighten her further, he turned and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the flickering firelight with her revealed truth and the echoing shock of his gentle words. The hours that followed Jacob's departure from the widow's cabin were the longest and most unsettled of his life. He paced the length of his large, empty house, the image of Eleanor's terrified eyes and the brutal landscape of her scars burned permanently onto the back of his eyelids. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof that matched the disquiet in his soul. He felt a shame so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. His home, which had always been his fortress, now felt like a place of judgment, and he was the accused. The cruel stupidity of the bet with Hank played over and over in his mind, each memory a fresh lash. He had reduced a woman's profound tragedy, her entire existence, to a wager over livestock. He had brought her here under false pretenses, and then, like the worst kind of trespasser, he had stumbled upon her most carefully guarded secret. He did not sleep. He sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, staring into the ashes of the previous night's fire, waiting for the dawn. When the first gray light finally seeped through the windows, washing the room in a pale, remorseful glow, he knew what he had to do. This could not stand. The silence that had existed between them before had been built on a foundation of mystery. Now it would be built on his transgression, and that was a foundation of sand. He had to face her, not as her employer, but as a man who had wronged her. He found her in the kitchen earlier than usual. She was already there, but everything was different. The heavy black wig was back in place, the veil drawn down, the armor fully restored. Yet the woman inside it seemed smaller, diminished, as if the act of reassembling her disguise had cost her the last of her strength. She flinched almost imperceptibly when he entered the room, her shoulders tensing as she stared fixedly at the stove. "Eleanor," he began, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. She stilled at the use of her name. He never used it. He took a step closer, but stopped when he saw her grip tighten on the edge of the counter. "I need to speak with you. Will you sit with me?" For a long moment, he thought she would refuse, that she would flee back to her cabin and lock the door. But then, with a slow, weary resignation, she gave a single nod. She did not look at him as she moved to the long wooden table and sat, her back rod straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, a figure of pure defensive endurance. Jacob sat opposite her, the scarred wooden table between them feeling like a canyon. He did not know how to start. He looked at the veil, knowing now what it hid, and the sight of it filled him with a new and painful understanding. "What I did last night was wrong," he said, the words coming out blunt and honest. "Coming into your private space, it was a deep disrespect." And the bet he swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "The bet I made with Hank to bring you here was the act of a proud and foolish man. It was cruel."
"I am sorry."
More sorry than I can ever rightly say." There was no response from behind the veil. He hadn't expected one. He was speaking into a void, offering an apology to a shadow. He took a breath, plunging forward. "I cannot pretend I didn't see. And I will not pretend it doesn't matter. But it matters not in the way you think." He leaned forward slightly, willing her to feel the sincerity in his words. "If you are willing, I would hear your story, not as your employer, just as one person to another." The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the pop of the fire in the stove. He watched her hands, still folded in her lap. One gloved finger twitched. Then, a sound emerged from behind the veil, so quiet he had to strain to hear it. It was a sigh, a long, shuddering exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of years. Slowly, as if the movement pained her, she raised her hands. With a grace that was heartbreaking, she lifted the heavy wig from her head and set it aside on the table. Then, with a final, visible gathering of courage, she reached up and pushed the veil back over the brim of her hat. There she was, Eleanor Vance. In the clear light of the kitchen morning, the scars on the right side of her face were stark and undeniable. But so was the quiet dignity in her eyes, which met his now, not with the blind terror of the night before, but with a cautious, weary resolve. She had chosen to be seen. Her voice, when she began to speak, was low and melodic, yet etched with a permanent sadness. "It was a fire," she began, her gaze fixed on a crack in the table. "The chimney in our little house, it caught in the dead of winter. My husband, Thomas, he was asleep upstairs." She spoke not in a rush of emotion, but with a flat, practiced cadence, as if she had told this story many times in the quiet of her own mind. "I tried to get to him. The ceiling in the hallway, it came down. Her unloved hand, he noticed for the first time that it, too, was marked by shiny, twisted skin drifted unconsciously to her cheek. They pull me out. They could not get to him in time." She paused, collecting herself. "After the people in our town, they were kind at first, but then they began to call me a curse, a bad omen. They said my face was a mark of God's displeasure. They would cross the street to avoid me. The children would run away." She finally looked up at him, and the raw pain in her eyes was more devastating than any scar. "So I left. I put on the veil, and I left everything behind. I came here hoping, I suppose I hoped for nothing, just to be left alone." Jacob listened, his own heart feeling as though it were being squeezed in a vice. He heard not just the story of the fire, but the deeper, more enduring story of the loneliness that had followed. It was a loneliness he recognized. It mirrored his own. Her scars were on the outside, a visible map of her loss. His were on the inside, hidden behind land and cattle and money, but no less real. When her words faded into the morning quiet, he did not offer empty pity. Instead, he did something he had never done with another living soul. He met her honesty with his own. "I understand loss," he said, his own voice rough. "My parents' fever took them both in one terrible week when I was young. I was left with this land, this house, all of it, and I built more. I acquired more. I became the richest rancher in the territory, thinking it would fill the quiet." He looked around the large, empty kitchen, then back at her. "It never does. All the cattle in the world can't keep you company on a long night. My walls are just as high as your veil, Eleanor. They're just made of something different." In the space between them, the canyon of the table seemed to narrow. They were no longer a wealthy rancher and a scarred widow. They were just two people, sitting in a quiet kitchen at dawn, showing each other the maps of their wounds. The silence that fell this time was not empty or awkward. It was full. It was the beginning of understanding. A profound and delicate shift took root on the Reacher Ranch in the days that followed the morning of shared confessions. The air, once thick with unspoken tension, now seemed to clear, charged instead with a new and tentative understanding. The invisible wall that had separated Jacob and Eleanor began, brick by careful brick, to dissolve. It started with small, conscious choices. The heavy black wig remained on the small table in her cabin. Eleanor still wore her dress and her hat for modesty's sake when outside, but within the walls of the main house, the veil was now always pushed back, her face, in its entirety, openly presented to the world of the ranch. It was an act of immense courage, a testament to the fragile trust Jacob's gentle honesty had fostered. Jacob, in turn, altered his own habits. He no longer took his meals at the far end of the long table, a solitary king in his hall. He began setting two places at one end, a quiet invitation she hesitantly accepted. Supper was no longer a silent affair. They began to talk. Tentatively at first about the weather, the health of the livestock, the need to mend a harness. But soon, the conversations deepened, stretching long past the clearing of the plates. Jacob found himself speaking of his hopes for the land, the challenges of a dry season, memories of his parents that were fond rather than painful. Eleanor, her voice growing steadier each day, spoke of her life before the fire, of a small flower garden she had kept, of books she had loved. They discovered a shared, dry sense of humor, and for the first time in living memory, genuine laughter echoed through the rooms of the main house. Jacob began to see her, truly see her. He noticed the way her eyes, the color of a summer sky, lit up when she spoke of things that brought her joy. He admired the quiet strength in her hands as she kneaded bread dough, the graceful way she moved through her chores. The scars on her face and neck ceased to be a separate thing to be looked at. They became simply a part of her, like the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. He saw not damaged goods, but a woman of immense resilience and gentle spirit who had endured the unendurable and yet had not been broken by it. Her beauty, he realized, was not in spite of her scars, but was woven through them, a testament to her survival. This new harmony extended beyond the house. One afternoon, a sudden, violent spring storm blew in from the west, a tempest of lashing rain and howling wind. The hands had already secured the major livestock, but in the frantic checking and double-checking, a panicked cry went up from Jessie. A newborn lamb, weak and disoriented, was missing from the pen where it had been sheltered with its mother. It had likely wandered off before the storm hit, and was now out in the open, vulnerable and doomed. Without a word, Jacob grabbed his slicker and headed for the door. To his astonishment, Eleanor was right behind him, pulling a shawl over her head. "You'll need another set of eyes," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. They plunged into the storm together, the wind tearing at their clothes, the rain stinging their faces. They called for the lamb, their voices swallowed by the gale, searching through the driving sheets of water. It was Eleanor who spotted it, a small, white bundle huddled and shivering beneath a scrubby juniper bush, its pitiful bleats lost in the wind. They fought their way to it together. Jacob scooped the trembling creature into his arms, shielding it with his body, while Eleanor led the way back to the barn, her shawl plastered to her head. Inside the dry, hay-scented warmth of the barn, they were both soaked to the skin, breathless and dripping onto the packed earth floor. The lamb, nestled in the straw with its frantic mother, was safe. Jacob turned to Eleanor. Rainwater streamed from her short, silver-gold hair and down her face, tracing the paths of her scars. Her dress was heavy with water, clinging to her slight frame. She was shivering, but her eyes were bright with the triumph of their rescue. He took a rough horse blanket from a nearby stall and moved to drape it over her shoulders. His hands, clumsy and cold, brushed against the wet skin of her neck as he adjusted the blanket. A jolt, like a spark from a flint, passed between them at the touch. They both froze. The sound of the storm outside faded into a distant roar. Jacob's hands stilled on the blanket, his gaze dropping to her lips, then lifting to lock with hers. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a startled, breathless awareness. The space between them, once measured in feet and formality, collapsed into mere inches, charged with a warmth that had nothing to do with the barn shelter. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Jacob leaned in. Eleanor did not move. She held her breath, her eyes fluttering closed. His lips met hers in a kiss that was not fierce or demanding, but achingly gentle, a question and an answer all at once. It was a kiss of shared cold and shared warmth, of rescued lambs and rescued hearts, a silent promise spoken in the quiet language of touch. When he finally drew back, the storm inside the barn was far greater than the one that raged outside. Her eyes opened, looking up at him with a dazed wonder, and in that look, Jacob Reacher felt the last of his own internal walls crumble to dust. The kiss in the rain-scented barn did not end with their parting. It hung in the air between them, a silent, seismic event that had irrevocably altered the landscape of their relationship. The walk back to the main house was undertaken in a breathless, charged silence, their hands brushing against each other, a new and potent awareness thrumming in the space between their bodies. The practicalities of changing into dry clothes were performed with a quiet, trembling urgency, both lost in the echo of that single, gentle touch. That night, the long wooden table felt like an impossible distance. The simple supper was eaten with stolen glances and soft, unspoken smiles, the food itself forgotten in the face of this new, terrifying, and wonderful understanding. In the days that followed, the ranch blossomed around them, mirroring the change in their hearts. The connection between Jacob and Eleanor deepened from a tentative trust into a profound and passionate bond. Their conversations now carried the easy intimacy of shared secrets and discovered affections. A touch on the arm, a hand brushed while passing a dish, a lingering look across a room. These small gestures became a new language they spoke fluently. The main house, once a monument to solitude, now felt like a home, filled with the quiet music of their shared life. Jacob knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that he had not just found a housekeeper or a companion. He had found his match, the missing piece of his soul he had not even known he was searching for. This newfound peace, however, was not destined to go unchallenged. The past, in the form of Hank's boorishness, arrived one afternoon on a cloud of dust and entitlement. The boastful rancher rode into the yard, his expression one of smug purpose. He had come, he loudly announced to Jesse, to finally settle his debt and hand over the prize bull to Jacob. He swaggered towards the corral where Jacob and Eleanor were examining a horse with a tender hoof. Eleanor, comfortable in her new life, had her veil pushed back, her face turned up to the sun as she listened to Jacob's diagnosis. Hank's steps faltered. His eyes, small and mean, widened as they landed on her. He took in the silver-gold hair, the clear, unafraid eyes, and the network of scars that graced her profile. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be hog-tied and branded," he drawled, his voice dripping with malicious delight. He let out a coarse laugh that shattered the afternoon's tranquility. "So that's what you've been hiding under all that netting, Reacher? I lost my best bull over this." He took a step closer, his gaze raking over Eleanor with cruel inspection. "A scarred creature like that? You must be desperate, or just plain foolish." The words hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Eleanor flinched as if struck, her hand instinctively moving toward her cheek, the old shame and fear flooding back into her eyes at the sound of his laughter. But before she could retreat, before she could even fully process the insult, Jacob moved. He did not shout. He did not even look at Hank at first. He simply stepped in front of Eleanor, placing his broad body squarely between her and the rancher, a human shield against the ugliness. Then he turned to face Hank. The easygoing rancher was gone. In his place stood a man whose expression was as hard and cold as granite. His eyes, usually warm, had turned to chips of flint. "You will get off my land," Jacob said, his voice low, but carrying a whip-crack of authority that made Hank's smirk vanish. "Now." Hank, recovering his bluster, spluttered. "Now hold on, Reacher. I've got your bull." "I don't want your bull," Jacob interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. "I don't want anything from you. You come onto my property and insult a lady under my protection? You are not welcome here. Not today, not ever." He took a single, menacing step forward, and Hank, for all his bravado, took an involuntary step back. The debt is cleared. Consider it payment for you learning some basic manners, though I doubt you're capable of it. Now get out of my sight before I help you leave. The transformation in Jacob was absolute. This was not about land or cattle or money. This was about honor. This was about her. Hank, seeing the genuine, dangerous fury in the other man's eyes, knew he had miscalculated catastrophically. Muttering curses under his breath, he turned and scrambled back onto his horse, riding out of the yard at a pace just short of a gallop. The moment he was gone, the fierce tension drained from Jacob's shoulders. He turned back to Eleanor. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a look of stunned, profound wonder. He had not just defended her. He had defended her truth, her right to exist without shame, without hiding. He had chosen her, scars and all, in front of the world. That night, under a canopy of brilliant stars, Jacob went to her cabin. He did not knock and wait outside. He called her name softly, and she opened the door, her face illuminated by the soft light of a single lamp. No words were needed. The look that passed between them said everything. He crossed the threshold, and she stepped into his arms. Their coming together was not one of frantic passion, but of deep, soul-searing certainty. It was a silent vow, a physical sealing of the bond that had been growing between them for weeks. In the quiet of her small cabin, surrounded by the whispering night, they found a healing comfort and a blazing passion in each other's arms, erasing the last echoes of Hank's cruelty and solidifying a love that had been forged in trust and redeemed by courage. A year turned on its axis, bringing with it the familiar golden light and the crisp, anticipatory air of the Redemption Creek social. The town square was once again filled with laughter, music, and the lively hum of the community gathered. It was a mirror of that fateful day, yet everything was profoundly, beautifully different. This time, Jacob Reacher did not stand alone on the saloon porch, a solitary observer of his own life. He stood firmly in the center of the square, and beside him, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, was Eleanor Vance. She wore a dress of deep blue, the color of the twilight sky, and on her head was a simple, elegant hat, its small veil pushed back to frame her face completely. She held her head high, her gaze meeting the world with a quiet confidence that had been hard-won. The scars were there for all to see, but they were no longer the first thing anyone noticed. They saw the woman who stood beside Jacob Reacher, her posture straight, her eyes clear and full of a serene happiness. The whispers that trailed them were not of suspicion or cruel curiosity, but of awe and respect. The town had watched the transformation over the passing months. They had seen the cold, wealthy rancher soften, his presence becoming warmer, more engaged. They had seen the mysterious, hidden widow blossom into a graceful, capable woman who commanded respect not through fear, but through her quiet strength and kind heart. The story of Hank's banishment had spread, painting Jacob not as a fool, but as a fiercely loyal protector, and Eleanor as a woman worth defending. As the fiddlers paused between songs, Jacob turned to face the crowd, drawing Eleanor with him. The murmuring died down, every eye fixed upon them. Jacob's voice, strong and clear, carried across the square without effort. "Friends," he began, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces. "A year ago, I came to this social, a lonely man. I made a foolish wager that night, one I will regret to my dying day for its poor intentions." He paused, looking down at Eleanor, his expression softening into something so full of love it was palpable. But fate, in its strange wisdom, saw fit to bring the most precious thing in my life into it because of that mistake. "This woman," he said, his voice thickening with emotion as he squeezed her hand, "has shown me that a man's wealth isn't measured in cattle or acreage, but in the love he holds in his heart. She has taught me about courage and trust and the true meaning of redemption." He turned fully to Eleanor now, taking both of her hands in his. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. "Eleanor Vance, you are my second chance. You are my home. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" A tear traced a path down Eleanor's smiling cheek, glistening in the afternoon sun. She did not hesitate. "Yes, Jacob," she said, her voice firm and joyful, carrying to the edges of the crowd. "1,000 times yes." A roar of applause and happy cheers erupted from the crowd, a wave of genuine warmth and celebration that washed over them. The stigma was gone, burned away in the forge of their unwavering love and the town's collective witness to it. They were no longer a subject of gossip, but a testament to the power of unexpected love. As the music struck up again, a lively reel, Jacob swept Eleanor into his arms for a brief, joyous turn, her laughter mixing with his, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. They stood together, watching the celebration they had inspired, their future stretching out before them like the endless Wyoming horizon, bright, open, and full of promise. The scars of the past would always be a part of them, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of the journey that had led them to this moment, to this forever after they had built together, piece by trusting piece, on the solid ground of redemption. If you were moved by Jacob and Eleanor's journey of second chances and found love in the unlikeliest of places, then ensure you never miss a story of heart and hope from the frontier. Subscribe to our channel for more timeless tales of redemption, courage, and love that conquers all. Your next adventure awaits.